Hey Jeff, how are you doing?
I'm fine, Stuart, and yourself?
I'm doing very well. I'm gearing up for our opening night in Greenwich next week, and
Very
uh, and I thought it would be nice to have a chance to talk with you a little bit about the two pieces for piano and orchestra that we're performing together. Each of
okay.
them by a composer who's really best known for other genres of music. Do you want to introduce these two pieces to our audience?
Sure. Well, one is the Keith Emerson Piano Concerto composed in 1977, and the second is Duke Ellington's New World A-Comin from 1945.
Now, the Keith Emerson concerto is among the several pieces by Keith Emerson that he released when he was part of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, which was an incredibly popular band in the 1970s. What was his background that allowed him to both succeed in the rock world and in the classical world?
I think Keith started as a classical pianist, taking piano lessons, learning the repertoire. And I think that love for the classics seeped into Emerson, Lake and Palmer, because when people who remember ELP, there's pictures in an exhibition, or Copeland Rodeo.
Yep.
When he went to play for Gina Stara, it was Gina Stara who said to him, and Keith said he was very picky about people. He didn't like the way people interpreted his music. And Keith played something for him, and he says, "That's the way my music is supposed to be played." And he took one of the movements of his suite, the Estancia suite, and he made that like into a rock version. And he did that with the Copeland and Mussorgsky. And then they did a lot of original compositions, Tarkus, and just the list goes on, and they toured all over the world. But Keith on his own composed this piano concerto, which he recorded with the London Philharmonic for the dual LP recording called Works.
Yep.
And I got to know Keith only because it was through Danny Dorff at Theodore Presser, who's a wonderful composer himself. And he had said, "Don't you know Keith's piano concerto with all these new pieces you're doing?" And I'm going back about 24 years or so, or 23 years. And I said, "I don't." He says, "I'm very surprised you don't know it." So he sent it to me. I fell in love with it. And I didn't have any email or communication with Keith, but Danny said, "Send me what you'd like to send to Keith, and I'll fax it or send it to him." So we did that, and that led to a fax exchange with Keith, which led to email, which led to a wonderful friendship, brotherly in many ways. And I ended up playing the concerto several times, and we finally met several years later in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, of all places, where Steve Larson conducted the piano concerto. And Keith came down with his girlfriend Mari, and came to the concert and loved it. I ended up doing the concerto in Keith Emerson concerts, creating birthday concerts for him. Like his 70th birthday, we did two concerts, one in Kentucky and one in Long Island, where they played some Copeland and did some music in the first half with the piano concerto. Second half, Keith came out and did his music with the orchestra.
Very cool.
Fabulous. Fabulous show.
So
He,
it's
he
it's
was
an interesting piece, this piano concerto, because you can't really define it in any one style. I mean, it begins with this crazy 12-tone section, and then it goes into kind of a fun, easy, almost rockish kind of syncopated melody. And then it opens up into this big hymn that sounds almost like the music of Edward Elgar. Um, when you're playing this piece, and of course, I have to mention the first cadenza and the first movement is pretty much straight jazz. So how do you approach this as a pianist? I mean, it seems like it's constantly shifting gear on you.
Well, what he does with that 12 tone is he extends the intervals a little and makes it melody. And one of the jaunty sections is straight out of like you would think it was by Gina Stara. It's really so rhythmically wonderful, and the intervals of the seconds and the fourths, it's so much like his music. So I think it's a tip of the hat to Gina Stara. That slow theme is nice because it's not too long, and he gives you the theme and a little variation with the members of the orchestra. Then the piano comes in with it, and that leads to the big cadenza to the end of the first movement. The piece was burned in a fire when the fire destroyed his little composing hut. and he had to rewrite the whole thing out, and that's why the third movement was written after he was kind of in a fury, in a
Oh, I
state of
didn't know
fury.
that.
That's why the third movement has so much fire in it. It's just,
It
yeah.
does. And yet, even the third movement opens up into one of these extremely grand romantic piano concerto moments at the end. He knows
And
how to
what's
finish a piece.
He does, and even the second movement's very brief, but it's a little sorbet in between the two movements. And even though the music sounds like contemporary, it still sounds contemporary. To me, it's a timeless piece. It doesn't sound like you could say it was written in this time or that time, but the harmonies and the intervals and the themes are so different from anyone else. And you could only say it's by Keith Emerson. It is so that original.
And it's charming, pretty much from beginning to end. It's a piece that makes you smile.
And it's good for the pianist because it really makes you play.
Yeah.
And being a pianist, a keyboard wizard that he really did a wonderful job. And as most pieces, they don't become respected enough by the masses to seep into the repertoire. And I think this has the chance to do it.
Yeah, certainly a worthwhile choice. So let's move to the other piece. This is a piece by perhaps the greatest of the jazz artists of all time, one of the most influential musicians our country has produced, and that's Duke Ellington. Talk a little bit about New World A-Comin and how you came to find this piece.
Well, I was actually asked to play it with the Orchestra de la Suisse Romande with Pinkas Steinberg conducting. And it actually ended up, the performance happened on the first night of the Iraq War in 2003, wow. I think it was. And I got the music from Schirmer because it's the Maurice Perez arrangement. There's another one by Jeff Tyzik, but this one was the Perez that they asked for. And when I listened to the recording that Maurice conducted with Sir Roland Hanna at the piano, incredible jazz pianist, there's a cadenza toward the end. And I asked Maurice, where is that? It's not in the music. He says, oh, no, Roland just did it on the spot. I said, is it written down? He says, no, why don't you write it down and send it to me, and I'll ask Roland what he thinks. So I wrote it down note to note. Yep. And I faxed it to him back then. Didn't have email yet. And he responded and said, Roland said you got it 100% and said you should play it. Fantastic. So I was so happy, and I put that in my performances.
Well, let's talk about that for a moment, because when you hear this piece, or when an audience hears this piece, they're going to think, this is jazz. And yet it's written out note for note. It really isn't jazz. It's a classical piece in jazz style. Are you a jazz pianist? Do you improvise in that way?
Very little improvisation. I'm more of a recreator than a creator. But I can do some, but I'm not, it's not my, like a native tongue to my fingers to be able to just sit down and look at chord names and go off on that. I can't do that. If it's written out, no problem. Lalo Schifrin's Piano Concerto of the Americas, everything written out, no problem. Claude Bolling's Suite for Flute and Jazz Piano written out, no problem, except the cello suite is not totally written out. And I had to figure out ways to improvise, but I had to write them in pencil so that I had some guidelines.
Well, and yet the style is completely there. You obviously feel very comfortable in this world of music.
You try, you get used to it. It's like learning a language.
Well, if I had to come up with a comparison for this particular piece, New World A-Comin, it would be Rhapsody in Blue. It has the same kind of episodic nature to it, with some themes that are from beginning to end, but others that just kind of show up and disappear as quickly. And when you're playing this piece, does this occur to you? I mean, you've played Rhapsody in Blue probably hundreds of times over the course of your career.
The Ellington, again, it's his own language. Only he could write like that. Just the way he writes riffs, the virtuosic things, and just the melodies, the harmonies, the rhythms. It's purely Ellington. And he based it on a book from the mid-1940s. And basically the story, I mean, people who would read the program notes in the recording that I did, I recorded the Emerson and the Ellington for Naxos with Brown University Orchestra, and it was terrific, and with Paul Phillips. And the story is really that Ellington wrote this music based on a book, New World A-Comin. It's all about how the African American world will rise up and be strong, and that they would also come to lead the world along with everybody else. And even then, all the issues that confront us today, it's things that just don't end. So the music really does reflect an energy and a hopefulness, and that's timeless. Again, a piece from 1945, you wouldn't know it was from then because that style is timeless. So I really like playing these pieces because they are, although labeled in a way jazz, they're two totally different dialects.
Yeah. Well, all I can say is I'm incredibly excited to once again collaborate with you. I think you are the single guest artist that I've collaborated most with. And
Really,
every time it's a tremendous joy. So I can't wait to introduce you to Greenwich, to our beautiful auditorium and our wonderful orchestra.
I look forward to it so very, very much. I've known of the orchestra for decades, and I'm so thrilled to actually make my debut with the Greenwich Symphony with you, of all
Well,
people. So I'm very blessed and very honored and happy that you've invited me to open the season with these two wonderful works that the audience is just going to love if they haven't heard them before.
well, I'm looking forward to it myself. And in the meantime, safe travels, and I'll see you very soon, my friend.
I see you very, very soon. Thank
Take
you.
care.
You too.